Don't let Kale touch anything. Not a single document. Those weren't my brother's last spoken words because cancer had already stolen his voice. Instead, with trembling hands that could barely hold a pen, he forced himself to write just 2 words across a yellow notepad. Not Kale. 24 hours later, that same man lay unconscious while his devoted son calmly thanked every nurse, smiled at every doctor, and politely asked me to help settle a few family documents before it was too late. At that moment, I had no idea which one of them was trying to protect our family, and which one had already spent years preparing to destroy it. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. My name is Owen Hartwich. I was 69 years old when my phone rang on an ordinary Tuesday morning in Tucson, Arizona. The woman on the other end introduced herself as my older brother Hollis's hospice nurse in Boise, Idaho. She spoke gently, but there was no way to soften what she had to say. Hollis's condition had deteriorated overnight, and the doctors no longer believed he had much time left. If I wanted to see my brother again, I needed to leave immediately. 20 minutes later, I was already driving north. The 11-hour trip gave me far too much time to think about the man waiting at the other end of the road. Hollis was 4 years older than me, but after our father disappeared in 1968, he became much more than a brother. Before he was even old enough to drive, he became the man of the house. He taught me how to fix a leaking pipe, throw a baseball, keep my promises, and never look away when life became difficult. Every lesson that shaped the man I eventually became began with Hollis. If there was one person whose judgment I had trusted without question for more than 60 years, it was him. By the time I reached the hospice facility the following evening, the sun had already disappeared behind the Idaho foothills. The building looked peaceful from the outside, almost comforting, but inside it carried the quiet stillness that only places near the end of life seem to have. A nurse met me at the reception desk and silently led me down a long hallway before stopping outside room 214. She gently touched my arm and whispered, "He's been asking for you." Nothing prepared me for what I saw when I stepped inside. Hollis had always been a broad-shouldered, hard-working man whose presence alone made people feel safe. The figure lying beneath the blankets looked like only a shadow of the brother I had known. His cheeks were hollow, his breathing was shallow, and every movement seemed to require enormous effort. Yet the instant he saw me, his eyes became sharp with recognition. I hurried to his bedside and took his hand. "I'm here," I told him quietly. "You don't have to worry about anything anymore." His fingers tightened around mine with surprising strength. He tried to speak, but no words came out. I leaned closer, hoping to catch even a whisper. Instead, his eyes searched desperately around the room until they settled on a small notepad beside the bed. I immediately placed it into his hands together with a pen. His hand shook so violently that I wasn't even sure he could write. Slowly, painfully, he dragged the pen across the paper, one letter at a time. N-O-T. He stopped to catch his breath before continuing. K-A-L-E. Not Kale. I stared at those 2 words in complete disbelief. The next morning I woke stiff and exhausted in the visitor recliner beside my brother's bed, the folded notepad still tucked safely inside my shirt pocket. Before opening my eyes completely, my hand instinctively reached for it, almost hoping the words I had read the night before would somehow have changed. They hadn't. Not Kale. I read them again, searching for another meaning that simply wasn't there. Throughout the morning, Hollis drifted in and out of consciousness, but every attempt I made to ask him what he meant ended the same way. His lips moved without producing sound. His breathing became labored, and before he could explain anything, exhaustion pulled him back into sleep. Around 10:30, one of the nurses smiled while checking his medication and casually mentioned that Hollis's son had been calling every few hours for updates. "He's such a devoted man," she said warmly. "Your brother is lucky to have a son like Kale." There wasn't the slightest hint of doubt in her voice, and I found myself wondering whether I had misunderstood everything. Maybe the medication had confused Hollis. Maybe those 2 words meant something completely different. Maybe grief had already begun making me suspicious of things that weren't there. A little after 11, Hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway before a man carrying a small overnight bag appeared in the doorway. KALE. I hadn't seen him in nearly 5 years. He looked older, with streaks of gray beginning to appear around his temples, but he carried himself with the same quiet confidence I remembered. The moment he saw me, he crossed the room without hesitation and wrapped me in a firm hug. "Uncle Owen," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thank God you're here." It sounded sincere, completely sincere. He immediately walked to his father's bedside, gently took Hollis's hand, and leaned close. "Hey, Dad," he whispered. "I'm here now." I expected relief to spread across my brother's face. Instead, I watched something I couldn't explain. Hollis's fingers tightened around the bedrail beneath the blanket. His jaw stiffened. His breathing changed. It lasted only a second before he forced himself to become still again, subtle enough that nobody else in the room appeared to notice. Nobody except me. KALE continued talking softly about traffic, work, and how quickly he had driven from Spokane after receiving the call. Every sentence sounded exactly like what a loving son would say. Nurses smiled whenever they passed the doorway. Volunteers greeted him by name. One elderly patient even reached out to squeeze his arm and thanked him for taking such wonderful care of his father. It became obvious why everyone trusted him so easily. KALE remembered every employee's name, thanked every nurse personally, opened doors for visitors, and carried himself with a calm confidence that made people immediately lower their guard. By lunchtime, I almost felt embarrassed for doubting him. Later that afternoon, we sat together in the family lounge while drinking coffee. He asked about my health, my retirement, and how I had been coping since losing my wife Marlo almost 2 years earlier. Most people avoided conversations like that because they didn't know what to say. KALE listened patiently, asked thoughtful questions, and never interrupted. By the end of the conversation, I caught myself wondering whether Hollis's note had been nothing more than the confused thoughts of a dying man. Then everything changed again. We returned to Hollis's room just as he briefly regained consciousness. KALE immediately stepped beside the bed and gently took his father's hand once more. "Everything's under control, Dad," he said reassuringly. "You don't need to worry about anything." The reaction was immediate. Hollis slowly turned his head away from his own son, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice. But I had known my brother for more than 60 years, and I recognized fear when I saw it. His eyes searched across the room until they found mine. They held there for several long seconds. There was no confusion in them, no medication-induced haze, only fear and urgency. He tried lifting one trembling hand toward me, as though desperately trying to tell me something before it became too late. Before he could move another inch, fatigue overwhelmed him once again, and his eyes slowly closed. KALE calmly adjusted the blanket around his father's shoulders, thanked the nurse checking the monitors, and quietly stepped back without showing the slightest sign that anything unusual had happened. Watching him, I almost felt guilty for questioning such a thoughtful son. Almost. But every time doubt crept into my mind, I reached into my pocket and felt the folded piece of paper still resting there. 2 words. Not KALE. They were the only thing keeping me from convincing myself that what I had just witnessed was nothing more than my imagination. And for the first time since arriving in Boise, I realized the greatest danger wasn't that my brother had left me a warning I couldn't understand. The greatest danger was that the man he was warning me about had become so convincing that even I was beginning to believe him. That evening, after spending another exhausting day watching my brother fade in and out of consciousness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every logical explanation I came up with fell apart the moment I remembered the look in Hollis's eyes whenever KALE entered the room. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Real fear. Around 9 o'clock, after Hollis finally drifted into a deep sleep, I quietly stepped into the hallway to clear my head. The hospice had become almost silent. Soft footsteps echoed from distant nurses making their rounds. Monitors beeped quietly behind closed doors, and the faint scent of lavender mixed with disinfectant drifted through the air. I walked toward the small family kitchen to pour myself another cup of coffee, hoping caffeine might organize the chaos in my mind. On my way back, I noticed the elderly woman across the hall sitting beside her window exactly where I had seen her the previous night. A thick quilt covered her legs, and an unfinished crossword puzzle rested on her lap. She wasn't reading. She was watching me. When our eyes met, she slowly folded the puzzle closed and motioned for me to come closer. I hesitated for only a second before pulling a chair toward her doorway. "You look like a man carrying a weight that's getting heavier by the hour," she said quietly. I forced a tired smile. "Is it that obvious?" She smiled back. "At my age, people stop hiding things as well as they think they do." We sat in silence for several moments before she nodded toward Hollis's room. "Your brother had another difficult day." I nodded. "He did." She studied my face carefully before asking, "Did he leave you some kind of message?" My shoulders immediately stiffened. "Why would you ask that?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the hallway to make sure nobody else was nearby before lowering her voice. "Because these walls are thinner than people realize, and for the last 3 nights I've listened to your brother talking in his sleep." A cold sensation ran down my spine. "Talking about what?" She slowly shook her head. "Not what. Who?" I felt my heartbeat quicken. "His son?" She nodded once. "The nurses assume it's medication making him restless, but fear sounds the same in every language. I've heard enough of it in my lifetime to recognize it." I leaned forward. "What exactly has he been saying?" Her expression became unusually serious. "The same sentence over and over. He keeps saying he's running out of time. He keeps saying he should have fixed it sooner." My grip tightened around the coffee cup. "Fixed what?" "That part," she answered softly. "He never finishes." The hallway suddenly felt much colder. We remained silent until she asked another question that caught me completely off guard. "Has anyone asked you to sign anything yet?" I frowned. "No." She held my gaze for several long seconds. "Not yet," she repeated quietly. "Why does that matter?" She folded her hands together before answering. "Because when a dying man spends every night sounding terrified, and the person he's afraid of suddenly starts talking about paperwork before the funeral has even happened, I pay attention." My pulse began pounding. "You're talking about KALE." "I'm talking about what I've heard," she replied calmly. "Whether I'm right or wrong isn't something I can prove. But I've lived long enough to know what desperation sounds like." I wanted to dismiss her words as the imagination of another elderly patient, yet something about the certainty in her voice refused to let me. She wasn't gossiping. She wasn't trying to create drama. She sounded like someone carrying a burden she wished she didn't have. Finally, she leaned closer and spoke so quietly I almost missed it. "If your nephew places any papers in front of you tomorrow, don't sign a single page until someone completely independent reviews every word." I stared at her without speaking. "You really believe that?" she answered without hesitation. "Absolutely." Then she looked toward my brother's room one last time, before adding, "And remember something else, Mr. Hartwich. Any man who rushes a family into making legal decisions while someone they love is dying usually isn't thinking about the dying man. He's thinking about what happens after." Those words stayed with me long after I returned to Hollis's bedside. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my brother's trembling hand writing "Not KALE," heard Esther warning me not to sign anything, and watched KALE's calm smile growing harder to trust. By sunrise, I had made one decision. Before I put my name on a single document, I was going to find out exactly what my brother had been trying so desperately to warn me about. The following morning began quietly, almost peacefully, which somehow made me even more uncomfortable. Hollis slept through most of breakfast, his breathing shallow but steady, while nurses moved in and out of the room with practiced efficiency. I barely spoke. Esther's warning from the previous night kept replaying in my head. "Don't sign anything until someone completely independent reviews every page." Around 10 o'clock, KALE arrived carrying a dark leather portfolio tucked neatly beneath his arm. He greeted every nurse by name, thanked the receptionist for helping his family, and smiled warmly at everyone he passed. Watching him, it was almost impossible to imagine he could be hiding anything. When he stepped into Hollis's room, he gently squeezed his father's shoulder before turning toward me. "Uncle Owen," he said with the same calm confidence he always seemed to have, "would you mind stepping into the family conference room with me for a few minutes? There are a couple of things Dad wanted us to organize while he's still having lucid moments." The request sounded perfectly reasonable. Any family facing the loss of a loved one would eventually need to discuss practical matters. Still, the folded note inside my pocket and Esther's warning refused to let me relax. I followed him down the hallway into a small conference room overlooking the parking lot. KALE carefully opened his portfolio and spread several organized documents across the table. Property records, insurance summaries, funeral planning notes. Everything appeared neat, professional, and completely ordinary. He patiently explained each page without rushing me, almost as though he wanted me to feel comfortable. "Dad hated leaving unfinished business," he said. "He wanted to simplify things before everything becomes more complicated." The word simplify caught my attention. It sounded harmless, but it also sounded carefully chosen. After several minutes, KALE slid another document toward me. "This is probably the most important one," he explained. I looked down and immediately recognized the address. It was Hollis's lakeside cabin near Coeur d'Alene, the place where our family had celebrated birthdays, summer vacations, and countless fishing trips for more than 30 years. "Dad wants me to take responsibility for the property," KALE continued. "Someone has to maintain it, pay the taxes, and make decisions if the family can't agree." Again, everything sounded reasonable. Almost too reasonable. I slowly flipped through the pages without saying anything. Then I asked the first question that entered my mind. "Can I see the previous version?" KALE blinked. "Previous version?" "The paperwork before these changes," I replied. If Hollis wanted to simplify things, there must have been an earlier estate plan. For the first time since I'd arrived in Boise, I watched something change in KALE's expression. It lasted less than a second. A slight tightening around his eyes. A brief stiffness in his jaw. Then the warm smile returned. "Honestly, Uncle Owen, there isn't much difference. Dad simply updated a few details." I nodded slowly, but didn't let the subject go. I'd still like to compare them. The silence that followed lasted longer than it should have. Finally, KALE leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "I'll have to see whether the attorney still has those older copies." That answer immediately bothered me. Hollis had always kept meticulous records of every legal document he ever signed. If previous versions existed, he would almost certainly have copies somewhere. As we walked back toward Hollis's room, I noticed KALE checking his phone repeatedly. His calm confidence hadn't disappeared, but something about him felt different now. More alert, more cautious. Almost as if my simple question had disrupted a plan he thought would unfold much more smoothly. A few minutes later, KALE stepped outside to answer a phone call. The moment he disappeared through the front entrance, I pulled out my own phone. Years earlier, Hollis had mentioned the attorney who handled his legal affairs after his wife Patricia passed away. Her name was Marjorie Kestrel. After searching through old contacts for several minutes, I finally found her number. To my surprise, she answered almost immediately. I introduced myself and briefly explained why I was calling. I was careful not to accuse anyone of anything. I simply wanted to understand whether the documents I had just reviewed truly reflected my brother's wishes. There was a long pause before she finally spoke. "Mr. Hartwich, I can't discuss every detail over the phone without proper authorization, but I can tell you one thing." My grip tightened around the phone. "About 6 months ago, your brother made significant revisions to his estate plan." My heartbeat immediately accelerated. "Did those revisions involve the cabin?" Another pause. "Yes." I looked through the conference room window toward the parking lot where KALE was still talking on his phone. If someone told me the cabin was definitely being left entirely to KALE, I asked carefully, would that be accurate? Marjorie's answer came without hesitation. "No." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. "Then someone isn't telling me the truth." "That's correct," she replied calmly. "And before anyone signs or agrees to anything, I strongly recommend you review the complete estate file in person." As the call ended, I slowly lowered the phone and looked once more toward the parking lot. KALE finished his conversation, slipped his phone into his pocket, adjusted his jacket, and smiled politely at a nurse walking past him. Anyone watching from a distance would have seen the picture of a devoted son doing everything possible for his dying father. But after speaking with Marjorie Kestrel, I realized something that changed everything. Hollis hadn't left me those 2 words because he was confused. He had left them because he knew that once the paperwork appeared, I would be the only person standing between his family's future and whatever his son had been planning for months. The rest of that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about my conversation with Marjorie Kestrel. Every answer she had given created two new questions. Hollis had changed his estate plan only 6 months earlier. KALE knew about those changes. Yet he had carefully described them as nothing more than routine paperwork involving the cabin. That wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate omission. The question now wasn't whether my nephew was hiding something. The question was why. I returned to Hollis's room just before sunset. My brother was asleep, his breathing slower than it had been that morning, while the evening light spilled quietly across the blankets. KALE was sitting beside the window, answering emails on his laptop, as if he were handling an ordinary business trip, instead of watching his father die. He closed the computer the moment he noticed me and offered the same calm smile that seemed permanently attached to his face. "Everything okay?" he asked. "I spoke with Marjorie Kestrel," I replied. The smile remained, but something behind his eyes became noticeably sharper. "Dad's attorney?" "That's right." He nodded once. "I assumed you probably would." The answer surprised me. He wasn't denying anything. He wasn't nervous. He sounded like a man who had already prepared for every possible question. "She confirmed that Hollis changed his estate plan 6 months ago," I continued. KALE leaned back in his chair and slowly folded his hands together. "Dad and I argued about those changes for months," he admitted. That was the first completely honest sentence I had heard from him since arriving in Boise. "Argued about what?" I asked. He looked down for several seconds before answering. "Money." The single word hung between us. He explained that several business ventures over the previous few years had failed, forcing his father to help him financially more than once. He tried to make the losses sound like ordinary setbacks, the kind that happened to hard-working people chasing opportunities, but every explanation felt carefully rehearsed. Whenever I asked for specifics, he answered with vague phrases instead of facts. Investments, partnerships, bad timing, opportunities that simply hadn't worked out. The more he talked, the less I actually learned. Then, almost without realizing it, he brought his sister into the conversation. "Bryony always made everything worse," he said quietly. "She thinks Dad changed the estate because of me." "Did he?" I asked. KALE smiled without humor. "That's certainly what she'd like everyone to believe." There it was again. Every difficult subject somehow found its way back to Bryony. According to KALE, she had stopped visiting years earlier. She rarely answered Hollis's calls. She never came during chemotherapy. She wasn't there after the surgeries. She always had another excuse. Listening to him, I found myself remembering that I honestly couldn't recall the last family gathering where Bryony had been present. Maybe there really had been distance between them. Maybe some of what KALE said was true. But then another question occurred to me. Does she know how serious this is? KALE looked toward the hallway before answering. "She knows Dad's sick." "That's not what I asked." He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "She doesn't know how close we are to the end," he admitted. I stared at him in disbelief. "You haven't told her?" He slowly shook his head. "Not yet." "Why?" He sighed heavily before giving an answer that sounded polished enough to have been practiced many times. "Because every time money becomes part of the conversation, Bryony turns everything into a fight. Dad wanted peace during his final days." It was a reasonable explanation. Too reasonable. "So you decided for her?" I asked quietly. "I decided to protect Dad from unnecessary drama," he replied. We fell silent. Through the window, I watched visitors leaving the hospice while families embraced each other in the parking lot. Something about the entire conversation refused to settle comfortably in my mind. If Hollis truly wanted to see his daughter one last time, every hour mattered now. Who gave KALE the right to decide whether she deserved that chance? A few minutes later, a nurse entered the room to check Hollis's medication. As she finished adjusting the IV, she smiled warmly at KALE. "Your sister coming tomorrow?" she asked casually. KALE answered without missing a beat. "She's tied up with work right now, but she knows Dad's comfortable." The nurse nodded sympathetically and left. I looked directly at my nephew. "Comfortable?" I repeated after the door closed. "That's what you told her?" For the first time all day, His smile disappeared completely. Uncle Owen, sometimes people don't need every detail immediately. She's his daughter. She's also 3 states away. Exactly, I replied. Every hour you wait makes it less likely she'll arrive before he dies. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, picked up his portfolio, and quietly walked into the hallway. As I watched him disappear around the corner, I realized something that chilled me far more than Hollis's mysterious warning. KALE wasn't simply controlling the paperwork anymore. He was controlling who had access to a dying father, deciding who would be present during his final days, and carefully managing every piece of information that reached the rest of the family. At that moment, I stopped asking myself whether Bryony had abandoned her father. I began asking a far more disturbing question. What if she had never been given the chance to come home at all? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Esther warning me not to sign anything, remembered Marjorie's calm voice, confirming that Hollis had changed his estate plan, and replayed my conversation with KALE about Bryony over and over again. By sunrise, one thing had become painfully clear. My brother hadn't asked me to drive 11 hours across 2 states just to hold his hand while he died. He had needed someone he still trusted to stand between his family and whatever his son had been trying to accomplish. Around 10 o'clock the following morning, KALE arrived carrying the same leather portfolio, but this time he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a middle-aged man in a dark gray suit carrying a slim briefcase. Before either of them spoke, I already knew exactly who he was. The notary. My stomach tightened immediately. KALE greeted me with his usual calm smile, but there was a subtle urgency beneath it that hadn't been there before. "Morning, Uncle Owen. This is Robert Fletcher. He's helping us finalize a few documents Dad wanted completed while he's still able to make his wishes clear." Finalize. Yesterday, those papers had merely needed to be organized. Today, they suddenly needed to be finalized. The language had changed, and so had the pressure. The notary introduced himself politely, before explaining that he was simply there to witness signatures if Hollis wished to proceed. His tone was professional, completely unaware that he had just walked into a family already beginning to fracture. Together we entered Hollis's room. My brother was awake, but visibly weaker than the day before. The oxygen machine hummed steadily beside his bed, while sunlight filtered softly through the curtains. His eyes slowly moved across the room until they landed on the unfamiliar man carrying legal papers. Then they shifted toward KALE. I watched every change in his face. Fear. It appeared instantly. His breathing became uneven, and his fingers tightened against the blanket. This time I wasn't the only one who noticed. KALE noticed it too. The difference was that he deliberately pretended not to. Robert opened his briefcase and neatly arranged several documents across a rolling hospital tray. "Nothing complicated," he said pleasantly. "We'll simply review everything together, confirm Mr. Hartwich understands each document, and proceed only if he's comfortable." I stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "I'd like to review every page first," KALE answered immediately. "Of course." His smile never disappeared, but it had become noticeably thinner. I picked up the stack and began reading carefully. The first document involved the lakeside cabin exactly as KALE had described. The second granted broad authority over several financial accounts if Hollis became unable to manage them himself. The third involved insurance benefits. The fourth transferred significant decision-making authority over multiple assets before probate could even begin. My pulse quickened with every page I turned. This wasn't about maintaining one family cabin anymore. This was about consolidating control over nearly everything Hollis owned. I slowly lowered the papers and looked directly at KALE. "Yesterday you told me this was mostly about the cabin." He shrugged calmly. "It is. Lawyers just bundle everything together." Robert Fletcher shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "No," I replied quietly. "Lawyers don't accidentally transfer financial authority, insurance control, and estate management into one package. People do." The room became completely still. KALE inhaled slowly before taking one step closer. "Uncle Owen, we're running out of time." That sentence struck me harder than he intended because, for the first time, it didn't sound like concern for his father. It sounded like desperation to finish something before an opportunity disappeared forever. Exactly, I answered. Which is why nobody is signing a single page until I understand every word. Hollis had been watching us silently. When KALE reached toward the tray and gently said, "Dad, this is what we discussed," my brother did something that erased every remaining doubt I still carried. Very slowly, using nearly all the strength he had left, he shook his head. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't forceful, but it was unmistakable. No. Robert Fletcher immediately stopped reaching for the signature page. "Mr. Hartwich," he asked carefully, "are you indicating that you don't wish to proceed?" Hollis tried desperately to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he looked directly at me, then toward the documents, and finally back at me again. His meaning couldn't have been clearer if he had shouted it across the room. KALE answered before his father could try again. "He's confused. The medication has been affecting him all morning. Maybe," I interrupted calmly, "or maybe this is the clearest answer he's given anyone all week." For the first time since I had arrived in Boise, KALE completely lost control of his expression. His jaw tightened. Anger flashed across his face before disappearing almost instantly behind another practiced smile. But I had seen it. So had the notary. Robert quietly closed his folder without saying a word. He understood exactly what professional ethics required. No clear consent meant no signatures. KALE noticed the movement and immediately turned back toward me. "We're wasting precious time." "Then, let's call Bryony," I replied. His entire body became still. "What? Call your sister. If these documents truly represent Dad's wishes, she deserves to hear the explanation before anything happens." He stared at me without blinking. "That isn't necessary. Then it shouldn't be a problem." The silence that followed felt endless. Hollis watched both of us with exhausted eyes while the notary quietly stepped farther away from the bed, realizing this had become something much larger than paperwork. I slowly reached into my pocket for my phone. "If you won't call her," I said, "I will." And judging by the look that crossed KALE's face, I had just threatened the one thing he had spent the entire week trying harder than anything else to prevent. The moment I pulled out my phone, KALE turned and walked out of the room without another word. He didn't slam the door or raise his voice. That wasn't his style. He understood that angry people attracted attention, while calm people controlled the narrative. A few seconds later, I saw him through the hallway window, speaking quietly with one of the hospice administrators, smiling again as though nothing unusual had happened. Robert Fletcher apologized politely before leaving, explaining that without Hollis's unmistakable consent, he could not witness any legal documents. His departure felt like a temporary victory, but I knew it wouldn't be the last attempt. People who spent months preparing a plan rarely abandoned it after one setback. Once Hollis had fallen asleep again, I stepped into the hallway, searching for a breath of fresh air. Instead, I found Esther waiting outside her room, leaning lightly against her walker as though she had been expecting me. She looked toward KALE, who was still talking pleasantly with the administrator at the far end of the corridor. "He didn't get what he wanted," she said quietly. "Not today." I nodded. "You knew exactly what those papers were for." She gave me a tired smile. I recognized the look on his face before he even opened the folder. I helped her back into her chair, and for several moments neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked directly at me. "There are things I never wanted to become involved in, Mr. Hartwich. But after watching your brother suffer these last few weeks, I don't think staying silent is the right thing anymore." My pulse immediately quickened. "What do you know?" Esther folded her frail hands together before answering. "About 2 months ago, KALE began visiting more often. At first he was exactly the man everyone believes he is. Flowers, fresh fruit, long conversations with nurses. He even brought books for patients who didn't have family. Everyone adored him. That sounded exactly like the KALE I had watched charming every employee in the building. But then, I asked. Her expression slowly hardened. Then he started asking questions that had nothing to do with your brother's health. She explained that KALE regularly approached nurses, social workers, and even volunteers, asking whether Hollis had signed new paperwork, whether he still understood financial decisions, and whether anyone had documented moments of confusion. At first, those questions seemed reasonable. Families often worried about legal capacity during terminal illness. But according to Esther, the pattern never stopped. Every visit eventually returned to documents, signatures, witnesses, or property. He wasn't asking how much time your brother had left, she said softly. He kept asking whether your brother was still considered mentally competent. A chill ran through me. Did anyone think that was strange? Some did, she answered. Most didn't. He always wrapped those questions inside conversations about protecting his father. I remained silent, letting every word settle. Then Esther surprised me again. One afternoon, I accidentally overheard a phone conversation. My eyes lifted immediately. With who? I don't know, she admitted. He was standing near the courtyard entrance. He didn't realize I was sitting behind the hedge. She closed her eyes for a moment, carefully recalling the memory. I only remember one sentence because it frightened me. She looked directly into my eyes before repeating it exactly as she had heard it. If he changes his mind again, everything falls apart. The hallway suddenly felt colder. You're certain those were his words? She nodded without hesitation. I remember them because your brother cried for nearly an hour after that phone call ended. My heart skipped a beat. Hollis heard it? Yes. KALE went straight into his room afterward. Esther lowered her voice even further. Your brother wasn't angry when KALE left. He looked defeated. I tried fitting that memory together with everything Marjorie had told me about the estate revisions. Hollis had changed his legal documents 6 months earlier. 2 months ago, KALE was worried he might change them again. That meant whatever Hollis had done wasn't final in KALE's mind. He had still been trying to influence him. Esther reached into the pocket of her sweater and carefully removed a folded piece of paper. I wasn't sure whether to keep this, she admitted. But after today, I think it belongs with someone who can use it. She handed it to me. It wasn't a letter. It was a page, torn from a small notebook covered with shaky handwriting. At the top was a date from nearly 7 weeks earlier. Beneath it, Esther had written short observations, almost like personal reminders. KALE asked nurse about competency again. Social worker refused to answer, Hollis crying after visitor left. Patient whispered, "He won't stop." I stared at the page in silence. You wrote this? I asked. She nodded. My memory isn't what it used to be, so I write things down before I forget them. Every note was ordinary by itself. Together they painted a pattern I could no longer ignore. This wasn't one desperate conversation between a father and his son. It had been weeks of quiet pressure, repeated questions about legal capacity, and constant attempts to move important decisions forward before time ran out. As I carefully folded the page and slipped it into my pocket beside Hollis's handwritten warning, I realized I was no longer trying to solve a misunderstanding inside one grieving family. I was beginning to uncover a campaign that had been unfolding inside that hospice long before I had ever walked through its front doors. Hollis passed away just before dawn 2 days later. The hospice was quiet when the nurse placed a hand gently on my shoulder and whispered that he was gone. I had expected the moment for nearly a week, yet nothing prepared me for the silence that followed. My older brother, the man who had taught me to fish, to repair engines, and to keep my word no matter the cost, was simply gone. KALE stood beside the bed with his head lowered, tears running down his face. Anyone watching him would have believed they were witnessing the grief of a devoted son. Bryony arrived, less than an hour later, after driving through the night. The moment she entered the room and realized she had missed her father's final breath by only minutes, she collapsed against the doorway, sobbing uncontrollably. She wasn't crying because death had surprised her. She was crying because someone had stolen her chance to say goodbye. I watched KALE walk toward her with open arms, but she instinctively stepped backward. Neither of them spoke. The distance between them said everything words no longer could. 3 days after the funeral, Marjorie Kestrel scheduled the formal reading of Hollis's estate at her office in downtown Boise. Before leaving the hospice that morning, I stopped by Esther's room one last time. She squeezed my hand and quietly said, "Today you won't be looking for answers anymore. Today you'll learn who was telling the truth." Those words stayed with me throughout the drive. Marjorie's conference room was modest, but immaculate. Bryony sat beside me, exhausted from days of grief and unanswered questions. KALE arrived several minutes later wearing a dark suit, carrying the same leather portfolio I had come to associate with every uncomfortable conversation. He greeted everyone politely, even offering coffee before taking his seat. If I hadn't known everything I now knew, I might still have mistaken confidence for innocence. Once everyone was seated, Marjorie opened a thick estate file and began reviewing the legal formalities. She confirmed Hollis's final amendments had been executed 6 months earlier, while independent physicians had certified his legal capacity. She also confirmed that no additional amendments had been accepted afterward, despite several requests for appointments that had ultimately never taken place. I immediately noticed KALE shift slightly in his chair. It was almost invisible, but it was the first sign of genuine discomfort I had seen from him since this nightmare began. Marjorie continued. The lakeside cabin would not become KALE's sole responsibility, as he had repeatedly implied. Instead, ownership would remain equally divided between both children, with neither permitted to sell the property without the written consent of the other. Bryony looked up in surprise. KALE remained perfectly still. Then came the financial accounts. Rather than transferring broad control to KALE, Hollis had established an independent trust administered by a professional fiduciary until every outstanding obligation of the estate had been reviewed. Again, not what KALE had led me to believe. The insurance proceeds followed a similar pattern, distributed through fixed percentages that treated both children equally while reserving a charitable donation to the hospice that had cared for Hollis during his final months. Every page Marjorie read quietly dismantled another piece of the story KALE had been presenting inside the hospice. Finally, Marjorie reached the last section of the estate file and removed a sealed envelope. "Your brother left one additional written instruction," she said, looking toward me before addressing the room. He requested that this statement be read only if disagreement arose concerning his intentions. She carefully unfolded the document and began reading aloud. Hollis explained that the revisions made 6 months earlier had one purpose above all others: to ensure that no single family member could ever pressure, isolate, or manipulate the rest after his death. He acknowledged past financial assistance given to KALE, expressed hope that his son would rebuild his life honestly, and wrote that equal treatment did not mean equal trust. The room became completely silent. Then Marjorie read the sentence that seemed to stop time itself. "If anyone tells you I wanted one person controlling everything, they are not honoring my wishes. They are replacing them with their own." I slowly turned toward KALE. He was no longer looking at the attorney. He was staring at the table in front of him, his fingers locked tightly together. Bryony quietly wiped tears from her face, not because of the inheritance, but because she was hearing their father's voice one final time. As Marjorie closed the file, I realized Hollis had anticipated this conflict months before his death. He had known someone might attempt to reinterpret his decisions after he was gone. That was why he had left warnings in more than one place. The handwritten note hidden in the hospice, the carefully revised estate plan, and now this final written declaration. But as powerful as those words were, they still didn't explain the pattern Esther had documented, the repeated questions about competency, or why KALE had seemed so desperate to secure signatures before Hollis died. The estate had exposed his deception. It had not yet exposed everything he had done to make that deception succeed. The reading of Hollis's estate should have ended the entire conflict. His wishes had been made unmistakably clear. The inheritance had been distributed exactly as he intended, and every attempt to portray KALE as the unquestioned successor had collapsed inside a single afternoon. But as everyone slowly gathered their belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only uncovered the surface of something much larger. Hollis hadn't written "not KALE" because he was worried about an argument over inheritance. He had written those words because he believed his own son posed a genuine danger to the people he loved. That question stayed with me until Marjorie quietly asked Bryony and me to remain after KALE left the office. Once the conference room door closed behind him, she opened another folder that had never been placed on the table during the estate reading. "Your brother instructed me not to release this unless his family began questioning the circumstances surrounding his final months," she explained. Inside were copies of bank statements, transaction summaries, and handwritten notes Hollis had assembled before his health declined too far. At first glance, the records looked ordinary: monthly expenses, utility payments, medical bills. But as Marjorie walked us through them, a disturbing pattern emerged. During the previous year, Hollis had repeatedly transferred money into accounts connected to KALE. Some transfers were clearly marked as loans. Others carried vague descriptions, such as temporary assistance or business support. Together, they totaled well over $300,000. Bryony stared silently at the figures, visibly shocked. "Dad never told me any of this," she whispered. Marjorie nodded. "He didn't want either of you turning against each other while he was still alive." Then she pointed towards several withdrawals, made only weeks before Hollis entered hospice. Those transactions were different. They had been initiated online, using new banking credentials that Hollis himself had reported not recognizing. Although the transfers had ultimately been stopped after he contacted the bank, someone had clearly attempted to move substantial sums without completing the required verification process. "Your brother believed those attempts were unauthorized," Marjorie said calmly. "He requested an internal fraud review before he passed away." My pulse immediately quickened. Was the review completed? Not while he was alive. She reached into the folder and produced another document bearing the logo of the bank's financial security division. The investigation had continued after Hollis's death. Digital login records showed repeated access attempts originating from devices previously used by KALE to manage several family accounts with Hollis's permission. None of that proved criminal intent by itself. Access alone wasn't enough. But investigators had also discovered emails requesting changes to account permissions, draft authorization forms that had never been finalized, and multiple communications attempting to accelerate financial authority before Hollis lost legal capacity. Everything fit the pattern Esther had described inside the hospice. Weeks of quiet pressure, repeated concern about competency, constant urgency. Marjorie looked at both of us before speaking again. The bank referred its findings to the state's Financial Crimes Unit because the activity extended beyond estate planning. Bryony slowly covered her mouth with both hands. "You mean they're investigating KALE?" "They already are," Marjorie answered. 2 weeks later, I received a call from one of the investigators handling the case. He couldn't discuss every detail, but he confirmed that the review had expanded far beyond my brother's finances. Similar complaints had surfaced involving 2 elderly investors who had previously entered business partnerships with KALE. In each situation, control over money had gradually shifted through incomplete paperwork, urgent legal requests, or authority granted during periods of illness. Some cases ended without criminal charges because victims recovered before documents became effective. Others were still under review. Listening to the investigator, I finally understood why Hollis had become so frightened. He hadn't simply feared losing money. He had recognized a pattern he believed his own son would never stop repeating. Several days after that conversation, state investigators executed search warrants on records connected to KALE's consulting company. Local newspapers reported an expanding inquiry into suspected financial exploitation involving vulnerable adults. His business accounts were frozen pending review. Professional licenses tied to fiduciary consulting were suspended while regulators completed their investigation. None of it happened because of revenge. None of it happened because Bryony or I wanted to destroy him. It happened because facts collected over months by banks, attorneys, investigators, and even a dying father's careful records finally formed one undeniable picture. As I folded the newspaper and looked out across the quiet lake where Hollis and I had spent so many summers together, I realized the inheritance had never been the true legacy my brother wanted to protect. The money could always be replaced. Trust couldn't. And now, with the investigation growing larger every week, only one final question remained unanswered. After everything KALE had done, was it still possible for what remained of our family to heal, or had the damage become too deep for forgiveness ever to find a place again? Nearly 8 months have passed since I stood beside my brother's bed and watched him struggle to write 2 words that changed the course of everything that followed. Time has a strange way of softening grief without erasing it. I still miss Hollis every single day. There are mornings when I reach for the phone because I want to ask him a question about an old engine or a fishing spot we used to visit together, Before I remember, there will never be another answer. But alongside that sadness lives something else now: peace. The kind that only arrives after the truth has finally stopped hiding. The investigation into KALE continued for several months before state authorities announced formal financial exploitation charges connected to multiple victims, including attempted unauthorized control over assets belonging to vulnerable adults. I never celebrated the news. Watching your own nephew walk into a courthouse surrounded by attorneys and investigators is not a victory. It's the final chapter of a tragedy that began long before anyone realized it was unfolding. Bryony attended every hearing she was legally permitted to observe, not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted to understand how the brother she had loved as a child had slowly become someone capable of manipulating the very people who trusted him most. She cried more than once during those proceedings, and every tear reminded me that families rarely break apart all at once. They fracture one quiet decision at a time until one day nobody recognizes what remains. After the estate was finally settled, Bryony and I drove together to the lakeside cabin. The place looked exactly as Hollis had left it. His tackle box still rested beneath the old workbench. His favorite coffee mug still sat inside the kitchen cabinet, with a small crack along the handle that he had always insisted wasn't worth replacing. We spent the weekend cleaning, repairing loose boards on the dock, and talking about the father she wished she had been allowed to spend more time with during his final months. There were tears, but there was laughter too. For the first time in years, the cabin felt like a home instead of another asset waiting to be divided. Before leaving, we hung one framed photograph above the fireplace. It showed Hollis standing between Bryony and KALE when they were children, all three of them smiling after catching their first fish together. Neither of us wanted to erase the good memories simply because the ending had become painful. Remembering who someone once was does not excuse who they later chose to become, but neither should it erase the love that came before. A few weeks after our visit, I returned to the hospice to thank the people who had cared for my brother. The administrator told me that Hollis's charitable gift had funded a new family counseling program for relatives facing end-of-life decisions. His final act of generosity was already helping complete strangers navigate the same heartbreak our family had endured. Before I left, I stopped outside Esther's room. It was empty. A nurse gently explained that she had passed away peacefully only 3 weeks after Hollis. She had no close relatives, but among her personal belongings, the staff found a small handwritten note asking them to contact me if I ever returned. The envelope contained only a single sentence written in her careful, trembling handwriting. "Your brother was right to trust you." I sat in my truck for nearly 20 minutes holding that note, unable to speak. Hollis had given me the warning. Esther had given me the courage to believe it. Marjorie had protected the truth through the law. Bryony had chosen healing over bitterness. None of them could undo what had happened, but together they made sure one man's deception never became his family's future. If there's one lesson I carried away from all of this, it's that betrayal rarely arrives wearing the face of an enemy. Sometimes it arrives smiling, offering help, speaking softly, and convincing everyone else that it's the most trustworthy person in the room. That's why the people who truly protect us aren't always the loudest voices. Sometimes they're a dying brother who can barely hold a pen. Sometimes they're an elderly stranger everyone else overlooks. And sometimes the smallest warning, just 2 handwritten words, can save an entire family from losing far more than an inheritance. I still keep that folded piece of paper inside my wallet today. Not because it reminds me how my brother died, but because it reminds me how fiercely he fought to protect the people he loved until his very last breath.